Hello, everybody, and welcome to Law at the Library, which is a partnership between the Evanston Public Library, the Chicago Public Library, and the Chicago Bar Association. My name is Lorena Neal. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the legal literacy librarian at the Evanston Public Library. We're delighted to have everyone here tonight to discuss this evening's topic, how to start a business. Our presenter tonight will be Matthew Formeler, a partner at Formeler and Formeler LLP. I'll tell you a little bit about the format for this evening, and then we'll get everything started. I'll introduce our speaker, who will then give the presentation, followed by a question and answer period. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A window, which you'll find near the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the chat feature to ask your questions there. I'll collect your questions as they come up and give our presenter the opportunity to answer them at the end of the program, so feel free to add your questions whenever you think of them. If you have any technical issues or questions, feel free to direct those to me in the chat as well. I'm listed there as EPL webinar. Our next Law at the Library session will be a discussion on planning ahead, wills, trusts, and estate planning on Tuesday, May 23rd. You can see a list of upcoming topics and the registration links on both Evanston Public Libraries and Chicago Public Libraries websites. And I'll post a link to that in the chat once we get underway here. You can also see videos of previous topics covered on the Evanston Public Library YouTube page, and I will post a link to that, our playlist in the chat as well, if you're interested in checking that out. Our speaker tonight is Matthew Formeler. Since founding the firm in 2011, Matt has represented a diverse range of clients in both transactional and litigation matters. In his transactional practice, Matt focuses on startup formation and corporate transactions. He has assisted a number of founders and entrepreneurs in a variety of industries with the foundation of their businesses. Additionally, Matt has extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, equity transactions, entity formation, commercial real estate, and corporate representation of privately held businesses. For the 6th year in a row, he has been named an emerging lawyer in Illinois for closely and privately held business representation, as well as mergers and acquisitions law, a recognition earned by the top 2% of attorneys in Illinois under 40 years old in their area of practice. Matt received his bachelor's degree in business administration from Illinois Wesleyan University and his Juris Doctor from DePaul University College of Law. Welcome, Matt, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. So today we are going to discuss how to start a business. And the way I like to approach this is not necessarily start with some of the legal concerns, but start also with some of the practical business concerns. And what you will see in this presentation is that we're going to focus on a topical level to address as much in the pre-operating stage as we can, so that we can cover kind of all the practical concerns we're going to want to look at when we're starting a business. So I first have to start with a disclaimer here for your and mostly my benefit. You will see we will address a handful of tax topics here, but I am not a tax advisor or CPA. I'm merely putting them on your radar. And if you do have extensive questions about some of the tax concepts, I would encourage you to talk to a tax professional. So the first thing that I would like to kind of bring up here is we're going to be assuming a few different things. Sorry about that, jumped the gun. We're going to assume a few different things here about the business that you would form for the purposes of this presentation. So we're going to assume that this business is formed and operating in Illinois, that it's a for-profit business and not a not-for-profit or charitable organization. The business is an operating business, so it's not a investment or a holding company aimed to hold equity in a startup investment. And then lastly, this is not a professional entity operated by a professionally licensed practitioner of some sort. So the first step in really conceptualizing a business is doing your market research. And so I hear entrepreneurs all the time ask me, I have an idea or I have a service I'd like to provide, and I'd really like to start performing that service or selling that good or bringing that idea to market. And the best way to do that is to sort of find the following three tenets and stick with them and determine, at least from a preliminary standpoint, why are you looking to do this thing? So you're defining your why. You're sort of figuring out, why do I want to do this? And it's important because I see all the time, once you're up and running, understanding why you're doing something really helps to not only, I think, perform the service or sell the good better, but actually it's so much more authentic when you understand exactly why you're doing what you're going to do. And also gathering information on your customers and clients is really important. You need to know who you're going to sell to, who's your customer base, who's your target market. That can help you define a lot of different aspects of the business, and also learning about your competitors. I always say part of the reason why, in defining your why, as to why you're bringing a new business into the marketplace is because you feel you can do something better or different from your competitors. So I always encourage clients, take a look at what your competitors are doing, and maybe you can differentiate yourself a little bit by doing something other than what they're doing. Because if you're just adding the same set of services or the same good to the marketplace without being different, what are the chances that you're going to succeed? You probably have a much better chance if you're doing it a little bit differently than everyone else is doing it. So then some of the once you have answered those three questions, I typically encourage clients to start following this structure. The three really big silos that we're going to look at here are the pillars of starting your business. You want to develop a business plan. You want to determine the type of entity structure that you would like to operate under, and we'll get into all of these in detail. And you also want to determine, how am I going to finance this business? So how am I going to come up with the capital to get the business up and running? So let's talk about a business plan first. I typically define the business plan as the foundation of your business. It really is, it's simply a blueprint. You're coming up with a way to define and communicate your business's objectives. So what actually is in a business plan? You're going to come up with an executive summary, which is essentially you're going to, through defining the products or services you're offering, you're going to target sort of the ownership structure, who you're looking to do business with, how you're going to bring this service or these goods to customers and clients. You're going to pull the analysis from earlier when we talked about doing market research, and you're going to kind of flesh that out a bit. You're going to talk about, how do I advertise or market my business? And that can include online marketing. It can include cold calling. It can include networking and strategic partnerships. And you're going to then kind of go into some of the financial planning. So here's where you figure out, how much money do I need, or how much capital do I need? What types of resources do I need to get my business started? Do I need anything additional from cash? Do I need real estate? Do I need a certain type of equipment or good? You want to plan for those things. You want to price them out and create a budget. And then from there, you can forecast, a growth strategy. So you can project, if I meet certain benchmarks as I begin to operate in this first few months, this first 6 months, the first year, you can then project how you would, if you meet those benchmarks, you're going to use that revenue that you're projected to earn to grow the business. So you will see throughout this presentation, there's a few times where I'm going to give you this big caution sign here. And this is where I inject a little bit of legal nuance. So one thing I always tell clients before so let's say you come up with this business plan, you may have shared it with close family or friends, but I always encourage you, if you're going to start sharing your business plan with any third parties, you should determine whether or not you need a confidentiality agreement that's referred to as a non-disclosure agreement, or NDA, to protect any sensitive information. So if you have a business idea and you have incorporated into that business plan, you may have certain information where if a third party got a hold of it, they could use it to their advantage or compete with you. What a confidentiality agreement will do is it will simply say that the recipient of the information that you're presenting agrees to keep it confidential. They will only disclose that information under very, very limited circumstances. For instance, if a court compelled them to, and if they do breach the agreement, you would have some recourse so that you could protect your business idea and your interests. So who might see one of these business plans? Well, you might, if you're seeking capital, you may go to a bank or a lender or an investor and ask for money. And they may say, if I'm going to give you money, I need to see your business plan to see that this concept is really well thought out. Well, that would be one example. You may need to present your business plan to certain suppliers or distributors, depending on the type of business you have. Potential partners, let's say you're exploring, bringing in a founding partner with you that has something to offer that's unique to the business. You may want to protect your business plan with an NDA. You may want to bring on contractors or employees up front, so you may want to protect your interests there too. So a couple resources here. I'll leave this screen on for a minute. General business plan resources. I have found that the Small Business Associate or Administration has done a really good job of providing some template business plan information and some just guide, a slew of guides that really help our clients at that stage. Same thing in the city of Chicago, their business planning resources are really quite helpful to clients. So I would encourage you, if you're exploring creating a business plan, to maybe visit these two sites. And if you can't catch the link verbatim, you can just even Google, SBA business plan or, City of Chicago business plan, and you should be able to find these links as well. So now let's turn our attention to the stage where you've already created a business plan for your business. You've already created your approach to, at least some of the preliminary pieces. Now you're at the point where you're exploring operating under a legal entity structure. So what is a legal entity structure? For those that are unfamiliar, there are a few different options that are available. These are all what I call creatures of statute. So Illinois, for instance, has statutes that cover various business entities. And these business entities are designed for you to operate through them, and they create a shield in front of you of liability. So you'll see there's four boxes here, and one of them talks about differing liability protection. One of the advantages of forming a business entity to operate under is if you don't operate under a business entity, you are operating as what we call a sole proprietor. And that means from a legal and tax standpoint, you individually are operating your business as if there's no shield in front of you. From a tax standpoint, there's no taxable entity. So all the revenue that you generate as a business is taxed to you individually. And then if there is any business liability, there's really no difference between suing the business and suing you individually, which is not a good thing. So what we think about when we're looking at forming a business entity, and some of these you may have heard of, like a corporation, and a limited liability company, a limited liability partnership. We're going to focus today on corporations and LLCs because they are by far the two most prominent entity structures that we see these days. So in terms of different liability protection, corporations offer slightly different liability protection from LLCs, and LLCs from partnerships and other types of business entities. But the principle is, when you set up a business entity and you do it the right way, and you begin operating your business under an LLC or a corporation, you are protecting your individual interests in your assets, because if the business is ever, sued or liable for something that the business did, you personally will not be liable unless there's very limited circumstances where a court would permit a plaintiff to, what we call, pierce the corporate veil and bypass the liability shield of an entity and get to your personal assets. So the real key to remember is, if you have a proper business entity and you're doing things above board, if the business is sued for some reason, whether over a contract, an unpaid liability, or something like that, really the only liability that the business suffers, worst case scenario, is typically the extent of the assets of the business, not your personal assets. So the next point is that these different business entities typically have different tax treatments. So limited liability companies are taxed by default as a pass-through entity, which means that all the revenue that the business generates bypasses the entity structure itself and goes straight to the individual owners. And so from a tax standpoint, that can be advantageous, where if you set up a standard corporation, what we see is double taxation, where the corporation itself is taxed on all the revenue that it generates, and then any income that's paid to the owners as dividends or distributions is taxed again at their personal income tax level. So we typically avoid a corporation unless there's specific reasons that we would look at to set up a corporate entity for a client. Now, there's also something we will talk about shortly called an S Corp, or a small business corporation. And that has unique tax advantages, where you can have a corporate structure or a limited liability structure, but you could be taxed like a small business corporation, which has some unique tax benefits. The other two boxes refer to corporations are managed and controlled differently than a limited liability company, and we'll get into that in a minute. But essentially, you have a board of directors with a corporation, where you have what we call a board of managers with a limited liability company, and they're slightly different in how they operate and control decision making. And then we look at different financing option and ownership structures. So corporations offer many more options for ownership and types of ownership than limited liability companies do. And that's because LLCs are a hybrid or a marriage of corporate law and partnership law. So you have basically, a certain type of interest in a LLC, where a corporation, you can have common stock, preferred stock, you can have stock options, you can have stock appreciation rights and warrants and things that, some of those things you can have in an LLC, but not all of them. And so, as I mentioned before, sometimes there's reasons why we would suggest a client set up a corporation for their business. And that might be one reason why we would look at that, is offering a more flexible arrangement of ownership options. So, as I said, two most popular structures that we see these days are LLCs and corporations. So what are corporations? As I mentioned, corporations are governed by the Business Corporations Act. So they're a creature of statute, and the statute basically dictates what you can and cannot do in Illinois with a corporation. So corporations are typically owned by shareholders, and you can have multiple classes of ownership. So depending on what your business goals are. So if you're looking to bring on investors, investors may want to invest in your business, but they may want certain rights associated with their stock where they have certain control, or they may want to have certain priority in when they're paid a distribution because they put up all this money to the business. So they may want certain like liquidation rights, anti-dilution rights, or preferences in getting paid first on distributions. And that would be associated with creating a separate class of stock for them. You can do that in a corporation. As I mentioned, there's generally two levels of taxation with a corporation. And we look at the ownership structure. As I mentioned, the corporate structure is what I would think is very rigid. It's very well known. A lot of investors are comfortable with the corporate structure because they know that you have a board of directors. Directors have certain control over day-to-day decisions for a company. So when you set up your corporation and you're aiming to say, hey, who would make day-to-day decisions? Those would be the folks that are appointed as your directors. And then shareholders, you can customize your ownership documents where shareholders may have some votes on, or they may have all the votes. It's really customizable, but it's important to know that you don't really deviate too much from the board of directors structure and shareholder structure with a corporation. Now, limited liability companies, instead of being owned by shareholders, they're owned by what we call members. And instead of classes of or shares of stock, we're looking at either units or percentage of a membership interest in the LLC. And instead of having a board of directors, we have board of managers or a single manager. And the managers are typically making the day-to-day decisions with an LLC. As I mentioned before, one of the nice benefits of an LLC is you can be taxed as a pass-through entity, so that all the revenue from the LLC is taxed directly, or it's assessed at the personal income tax level. Like a corporation, you can be taxed as an S corp as well. And LLCs offer really, in my mind, corporations and LLCs offer very similar shields of liability for their owners, but LLCs have slightly better creditors' rights, I think. And I really like with LLCs, one practical tip that I hear complaints all the time from clients. So and we'll get to filing and starting an actual entity, but when clients are starting an entity, corporations have a number of different ownership documents or governance documents. What's really nice about an LLC is it has a single governing document, and it's called an operating agreement. And so where you might have 3 or 4 documents combined for a corporation that contain all of the different governance principles, with an LLC, you have the single operating agreement that sort of covers all of it. And because LLCs are sort of a marriage between corporate and partnership law, it's infinitely flexible, where you can structure a LLC to be like a corporation. You could structure it to be more like a partnership or some hybrid in between. And that flexibility is often what most business owners crave, unless they're really looking at certain long-term goals that a corporation would be more suitable for. So let's talk about actually forming an entity in Illinois. Now, my official advice is you should always engage an attorney to help you with this process, because not only can we help guide you in the right direction in terms of what type of entity to set up, but also forming entities are something that we do frequently, and this is something we're very comfortable with and familiar with. So what you do is you're going to file your business entity with the Business Services Division of the Secretary of State of Illinois. So you're going to go on the Secretary of State website. There's a business services tab. And it's really important to highlight that each entity type has its own division within the business services division. And the reason that's important is because I have seen people before accidentally form the wrong type of entity because they did not, they were not aware that there were like multiple types of divisions. So if you're filing an LLC and you accidentally fill out paperwork for a corporation, not knowing, or an LLP or something on accident, there's very little recourse other than dissolving the entity or letting it lapse and filing a new one. So you want to make sure you have these documents right before you file anything, and being aware that there are these multiple segmented divisions within the business services division is important. So there's one for corporations, there's ones for limited liability companies, there's ones for not-for-profit organizations. They're all broken down and identifiable. So if you're filing an LLC, you're going to file what's called Articles of Organization. And it's a form you can obtain on the Secretary of State website. It's a very simple form. It's really not asking for more than the name of the business, the principal address of the business, who the registered agent is of the business, and the owners, the roster of the owners. The articles of incorporation for a corporation are slightly more complex because corporate entities have to list, in addition to those things that I just mentioned, they also have to list information about the stock that is issued and authorized by the company. And what that means, authorized means how many shares of stock the company has in its stable to issue to owners. And the company can always authorize additional amounts of shares, but you have to list on the initial form how many shares of stock you've authorized, how many shares are being issued to the owners, and is there a par value of this stock? Is there no par value? What's the amount of paid in capital? And that can be a little bit tedious. And by the way, I have put below, there is a link for the business services tab of the Secretary of State. But again, if you just go on a search engine and search Illinois Secretary of State Business Services Division, you will find it right away. So to just quickly go through some of these things, because a lot of people have asked me sort of what are these things. So the legal business name is the name that the state will recognize your business as, and this is not to be confused with a trademark or a brand. This is literally if you're a business and you want to call yourself, Widgets and Things LLC, that would be your business name. And the state would only recognize you under that name. The principal place of business is your address that you are operating your business out of. Just know that sometimes owners want some privacy and they don't want to list, if it's a home-based business, their home address. So they think, well, I'll go get a P.O. box from the post office and that will serve as my business address. The Secretary of State will not let you register a business address as a P.O. box. One creative solution is you can go either the post offices or the UPS or FedEx, they have programs where you can use a P.O. box through a street address. So you can, essentially get a P.O. box, but have a street address to use as registration. So the registered agent is either an entity or an individual who is an Illinois resident or is organized in Illinois. And every business has to have a registered agent, whether this is for a LLC or a corporation. And the registered agent is the party that will receive on an annual basis. They'll get your annual report, which is something you have to file each year for your entity. And that basically renews your entity with the Secretary of State each year. So it's important to have a registered agent who's responsive. So if you're not going to serve in that role yourself, you want somebody, for instance, we often serve for a small fee for our clients as registered agents, so that they know as soon as that gets sent to our office, we will notify them and file it on their behalf. Another purpose of the registered agent is if the business were to get sued someday, typically the registered agent is served a summons of process for a suit or a subpoena, or some legal action. So you want to make sure that, whoever you designate as the registered agent, whether it's yourself or a company, there are companies you can hire that will do this for you for a fee, or if you're using an attorney or trusted advisor like an accountant, that they're going to be responsive. So the purpose statement is generally these days automatically kind of input into the form already, so you don't really have to worry about it. Only times you would really need to worry about that is if you're filing some sort of specialized entity where you may have a need in something we're not addressing today, like a professional services entity, where you have professionally licensed folks that are owning the entity. You may have to list whatever that professional license practice is or something, but for the most part, you don't need to edit the purpose statement. The ownership information, as I said, is just a list of who the owners are and their address. We talked about the stock information with corporations. And then lastly, the incorporator or organizer. So whoever is filing the articles with the Secretary of State is what we call the incorporator or the organizer. And you have to sign that on the form. So typically, if it's, for my clients, if I'm doing it, I'm the incorporator, the organizer. There are some documents, some initial governing documents where, we will resign as the incorporator or organizer. But if you're doing it yourself, it's no big deal. So one practical tip I had mentioned before, your legal entity name is not the same as a trademark, but something that's really important to think about. Before you form your business, it's always a good idea to do some research and make sure that the name is available and not used, either in Illinois or somewhere else. And the reason I say that is the first thing you're going to do is make sure that the name is available with the Secretary of State. Basically, there's a search function that's really easy to find on the business services section. So if you're going to form an LLC, you would click in the LLC search, and you would type in the name that you're thinking of using and seeing if it's in use or not. It will come up with, if it is in use, it will show you the actual businesses that are using the business that's using it, or names that are similar. If it's not in use, you'll get a no results indication. And the Illinois Secretary of State will not let you file a business with a name that already exists with an active business. So that's first. You want to make sure the name's available to the Secretary of State. But another thing you want to do is make sure that the business itself is not, the business name itself is not being used elsewhere, where if, for instance, a business in a different state is using the name and they have a federal trademark with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, they may have some ability to stop you from using that name if they come across it. So one thing I always encourage clients to do before you file your business name or your formation documents is do a quick search engine search and see if anyone's using the name anywhere. And it's a good indicator of, whether you're going to have issues, because the last thing you want to do is essentially start a business only to get a letter from some lawyer saying, hey, my client owns that name. You can't use it. You need to stop using it. You don't want to have to go through that. So you would much rather do your due diligence up front and make sure the name's, freely available so you can use it. So the next step after you have filed your articles of organization or incorporation is you need to get a federal tax ID number. And this is because the separate business legal entity that you just filed is its own taxable entity. So even if it's a pass-through like an LLC, you still need a federal tax ID. So you can get that directly on the IRS website. It's not complicated at all to do. I do it often for clients. A lot of clients can do it themselves. Essentially, what you're going to do is give the IRS information about the business. So you're going to give them all the sort of biographical information about the business, its name, its address. You need to give them somebody who will be what they call the responsible party for the entity. And that's typically the single owner or one of the majority owners. And you will have to classify the business to them, just letting them know sort of what kind of business it is. And you can do this online. It takes about 10 minutes, and they will send you immediately. Once you click submit, you will get a letter that you can download as a PDF that you will need to save. And let me tell you a practical tip. I have had some clients that have done it themselves and they didn't save the EIN letter. If you don't save that, it is a real pain to call the IRS and try to get your EIN later when you need it for tax purposes. So I always tell clients, as soon as you click submit, make sure you download that PDF and save it, because you will need that. So that, once you have done that, as I mentioned before, you have the option of filing as a small business corporation. So we call that an S election. And you want to discuss with your tax professional whether or not that's appropriate for you and your business. So just quickly, what an S election is it allows owners to avoid that double taxation. And it has certain additional tax benefits where, you're not paying self-employment tax on the entire amount of your gross, revenue, only a portion of it. So it's really beneficial to explore with an accountant to sort of run some projected numbers and say, hey, assuming in year one I made $100,000, if I were taxed as if I'm an LLC and I say, if I were taxed as a pass-through, what would my tax liability be? And assuming I was an S Corp taxed LLC, what would that look like for me? I always tell clients, go explore that with your accountant, because it'll come down to the numbers. So it's important to know that when you form a business, you will have 75 days to file your S election for that calendar year. And if you don't file it within the 75 days, typically you have to wait till the next calendar year to file if you're going to make an S election. It's also important to know that when you make an S election, you can revoke it at any time. In certainly companies, as they operate, or businesses, their circumstances change. And when you start generating a certain amount of revenue, sometimes an S election it's no longer beneficial. And it may be more beneficial to be taxed like a pass-through, or you may want to convert to a corporation and be taxed that way. But just know, when you do make a revocation of that S election, you cannot make another S election for a period of time. So one thing to note from the legal side, what the IRS says, if you're going to enjoy the benefits of an S election, you need to, there are certain restrictions and guidelines that the IRS imposes. So if you're an S election LLC or an S Corp corporation, you can only have 100 or less shareholders, and you can only have one class of stock or entity or equity. So that might be a problem if you're looking at bringing in investors, or you want to offer incentive equity to employees or third parties. You can't do that with an S election. Also, owners of stock or membership interest of an S Corp have to be US citizens or green card holders. They cannot be visa holders or foreign aliens. So I always tell clients, and I have had this problem before, where if a client is going to offer equity to someone who's here on a certain type of work visa or a foreign investor, you cannot do that with an S Corp. So one last note about the tax piece. Don't assume you're finished when you get your EIN. or you just explore the S election, that's it. You may need to also register with the Department of Revenue here in Illinois, depending on what kind of business you are. So if you're going to be, if you're selling goods, you need to have a sales tax ID because you'll be paying sales tax to the state. If you're a wholesaler, there might be a different type of, in a reseller, there's a certificate of resale you need to get. So you want to explore with a tax professional. You want to make sure you get all of the tax registrations and licenses you need so that you pay the appropriate taxes and don't get in trouble down the line. Along that same vein, a common question I get from business owners when they first form, they go, okay, I set up my entity, I've got my tax stuff set up, now what? And one of those things we always inform them of is, hey, you may need to register with the state, and get a general business registration. You may need to have certain types of licenses or permits depending on where you're operating out of or what type of business you operate. So for instance, certain types of businesses require certain types of licenses or permits. So if you're a daycare facility, if you're a massage parlor, if you have certain types of manufacturing, you will need certain types of licenses. And so you can do some self-investigation, and I've provided some links that both the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois do a really good job of summarizing sort of what licenses you need. And I always say complying with those licenses is a legal concern, but filing for those licenses is very clerical. You're really just filling out an application. That takes a few minutes, but you want to make sure you have the appropriate licenses or permits. So I alluded to this previously, but I do want to mention, I have seen a number of folks, they'll set up a business entity like a LLC or a corporation, and then they won't take the next step, which is to have a proper governing document between the owners of the business. And so what an operating agreement, for instance, really does is it sets forth all of the governing principles of the business itself. So if you are running a business with 2 or 3 partners, this operating agreement will articulate what type of equity or membership interest in the LLC is being offered. So what rights do these owners have with the ownership equity that they have? What type of management structure do you have? So who makes what decisions and how are those decisions made? What if you have a deadlock where you have an even amount of owners and two owners say, we want to do X and 2 say Y? How do you resolve that? It talks about allocating profits and losses for tax purposes. It talks about, hey, what do we do if we generate a profit and we want to pay the owners a distribution? How do we do that? Who makes that decision? And in what order do we make these types of distributions? And then really importantly, it covers a bunch of transfer restrictions. So something people don't want to really think about at the inception of their business is, how do we limit our owners and our future partners or current partners in transferring the equity that they have? So if you're starting a small business and it's just you, these aren't very big concerns. But if you have a partner or more, you may want to make sure that, partner B doesn't have the ability to just go say, hey, my neighbor really likes our business, so I'm going to sell him 20% of my equity. Is that permissible or not? You want to predefine that in your operating agreement and say, well, without the consent of everyone, you can't just sell your equity to a third party. You also want to have what we call buy-sell provisions in these documents. And that says, hey, what happens if one of the owners, becomes disabled unexpectedly or passes away? What happens to their equity? That's not typically dealt with in somebody's estate plan. So we want to make sure that there is a blueprint in the operating agreement that discusses, in certain triggering events like death or disability or divorce, or one of the owners files for bankruptcy, what happens to their equity? Can the company buy it back? How do we determine the value of that equity? And how do we pay it out? These are all things that, whether it's likely or not to happen, it's foreseeable. which means it's possible. And so we should plan for these. And in my world, I see a lot of this actually happen. I have had partners of businesses call me and say, my partner dropped dead shoveling snow the other day. I don't know what to do. And not having a plan in place is a lot more costly and stressful than having a plan in place. And by the way, one more note is the difference in a corporation. You'll typically have bylaws which determine how the board operates and the officers. You will sometimes have a shareholders agreement. Sometimes you'll have directors agreements, voting rights agreements, buy-sell agreements. These are all separate, as I mentioned, separate documents where an operating agreement has it all in one. So the last big pillar we're going to talk about tonight is financing the business. So when you're talking about starting the business, you want to make sure that you're properly planning to fund the business and its operations at the start. So how do you do that? Are you going to self-finance? Are you going to go to a bank? And that can be a challenge if you have no operating history or no past relationship with the bank. They may not be willing to lend to you. Are you going to offer equity to an investor, or what we call debt, like a convertible note or a safe agreement, where somebody is going to loan the business money and that can convert into equity at a later date? Or are you going to pursue a crowdfunding measure? These are all things you want to plan for upfront. There's a number of concerns associated with them depending on how you do it. For instance, if you're offering equity or certain types of crowdfunding, you have to comply with securities laws, and that's a whole nother animal, and I could give an entire presentation on just that. But it is important to figure out at the outset, what's your plan for infusing this business with capital so that you can operate until the business is making enough money to sustain itself. And some things quickly to think about. I had mentioned the securities piece, but if you are going through a bank, you should be prepared to personally guarantee any loans or collateralize any loans. And you want to make sure you review, your business's governing documents in advance, so that if you give equity away, you want to make sure that the operating agreement, for instance, with the LLC is accommodating that circumstance of these new owners and all of that. I will quickly touch on, it is important to get proper insurance in the proper coverage amounts for your business. And the reason for that is, no amount of legal wrangling that I can do for a client can protect a client as much as good insurance can. And so I've listed a few different types. Workers' comp and employer liability insurance are mandatory if you have employees. Commercial general liability or professional liability policies are a really good idea, so that in the event that the business is sued and it falls under the insurance policy's coverage, that insurance policy will pay out and you're not paying out of pocket. You're just paying your premiums. Key person insurance is, as I mentioned before, with like buy-sell agreements, where if we're saying, hey, we're going to plan for if one of us passes away or becomes disabled, key person insurance can fund that through life insurance or disability insurance. And then more increasingly today, we're seeing the issue of cyber, coverage, because businesses are being hacked or held ransom by, scammers and hackers, and you want policies to protect you there. And then one real final piece here is, once you have all of that stuff sort of sorted out, you want to start working with a proper set of contracts for your business. And these can be a number of types of agreements. So you may be leasing office space. So you want to have a proper commercial lease. You may be bringing on employees or contractors. So you want to have proper agreements that comply with Illinois employment and contractor laws. You may be, a distribution, you may be, producing or manufacturing goods that you need to supply to somebody or distribute to customers, or have somebody distribute on your behalf. That's a whole set of agreements. Common agreements we see are services agreements, sales agreements, licensing agreements, SaaS, which is software as a service agreements. So these are just some examples. We always encourage our clients to have proper agreements with their clients, vendors, partners, other businesses so that you're protected. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I see there's a few in the Q&A in the chat. But if you want to get in touch with me outside of this, I have my QR code here. It'll take you to our website and it has all my contact information. But I'm ready for some questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. Very helpful to answer one of the first questions in the chat. There will be a recording available on the Evanston Public Library's YouTube Law at the Library playlist. Matt, are you willing to give a copy of the PowerPoint for us to send to participants also? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. All right, so we will take care of sending that to everyone who is registered for the program as well. First question from the Q&A is, where can I learn more about the professional business? I am a dietitian looking to form an LLC versus PLLC.
So it's a nuanced issue because you're dealing with two competing agencies in a sense. You have the Secretary of State, who doesn't really care what type of entity you set up, but the Department of Professional Responsibility cares about you being a PLLC. And oftentimes when you're starting a business and operating as a licensed professional, we are seeing now this tug of war where the IDPFR is saying, we won't renew your business license as a professional entity unless you're a PLLC. And structuring your business as a PLLC versus an LLC is slightly different because all of the owners of a PLLC have to have the same professional license, and there's some other things. But if you have other questions about that, I'm happy to, you can shoot me a note or an email, and I'm happy to answer a few questions for you.
Great. And then just for clarification purposes, should you apply for your employer insurance number before you submit for an LLC?
You only need to apply for that once you have employees or you're going to, because the Department of Unemployment Insurance requires you to have unemployment insurance when you have employees. And if you are a single owner company with no employees, even if you're an S Corp or you're structured as an employee, you don't need unemployment insurance. But once you have a single employee, that's when you need to register to have that number and insurance.
Great, thank you. What is the average cost for registered agents? Someone is using an online registered agent, and at this beginning stage of the business, $20 a month is too much for the business.
Usually they're assessed on an annual basis. Yeah, where you're seeing it's generally between $100 and $200 I see. But I also tell clients, like, if you're trying to keep things lean at first, as long as you are reliable, you can serve as your own registered agent. There's no qualifications other than you have to be over 18 and live in Illinois. And if you trust yourself to be responsive, I just see there are a number of my clients that say, I don't want that responsibility because I'm going to forget, or it's just not something I want on my radar, and so they'll just delegate that.
And just for clarification, can you be a registered agent for two different businesses? For example, this person is also listed as a registered agent for their condo association.
Yeah, you can be registered agent for, I personally serve as registered agent for over 70 businesses, so I haven't been yelled at yet.
Do you know any resources, or do you have any advice for an individual selling video games on Steam, which is a digital marketplace sort of where people can buy video games to play?
I suppose that it depends on, are these original video games that this individual is creating, or are they reselling video games? Because that would depend. My answer would depend on that. If you're creating original games, obviously you want to protect the product that you have. And intellectual property law is a nuanced thing. Protecting a video game is not, you don't just get carte blanche protection with some form of IP. There's four major categories of intellectual property: of trademarks, copyrights, patents, and trade secrets. And so it's some combination of those things to protect the games themselves so that others don't duplicate them or rip them off. And then also you want to make sure that you have proper, privacy policy, terms of service, anything in the e-commerce world, you're exchanging data and you want to make sure that you're accountable to customers and in others by saying, here's the type of data we collect, here's how we're using it, here's what we don't store, or here's who has access to our data. Those things are commonplace these days. And then you want to make sure that you are complying with, Steam's virtual, store and their conduct codes and all of that. They may require you to have certain language or terms in your storefront, but it's always a good idea to run all this by a lawyer.
The next question is, someone has an online business selling headphones and handbags on Amazon. Do they need a permit for that?
Well, since they're selling goods, I don't recall if Amazon gives you sort of an all-in-one package where they also help take care of some of the tax registration. But if you're selling goods as an independent, seller, whether it's resale or wholesale, you likely need some tax registration with the Department of Revenue for that.
All right,
So you can
and then
sales tax or wholesale resale tax.
And then the second half of this person's question is, they do not have any sales since starting late last year. Do they still need to file taxes for that business?
That would be a question I would ask an accountant. My lay opinion is I believe you do. I've had, only because I know that I've had clients that reported no income for a number, like 2 or 3 years for some reason. And once they finally did file taxes, the IRS came down on them and said, hey, you've been organized for 3 years and you haven't filed a tax return yet. You can usually get a grant of some relief, but I would encourage you to probably file or talk to an accountant about filing a return, even if it's zeroed out, so you don't get in trouble with the IRS.
Sure. Is there a cost savings to filing in Delaware, Wyoming, or Nevada, for example, instead of in Illinois?
I get this question a lot. And the reason most people think this is because you don't pay in-state tax as an out-of-state resident business owner. So if you file an entity in Delaware, you're not paying Delaware income tax on the revenue that your company generates. You're only having to pay the federal, tax to the IRS. That doesn't mean you won't have to pay Illinois income tax because that's where you live. So there are strategic reasons why we encourage clients to set up in different states. Delaware is very pro-management. It's a very favorable state in terms of corporate laws. So I generally advise clients, if you are operating in multiple states where you have physical locations or main customer streams in multiple states, setting up in Delaware is not a bad idea. But some of these other states like Wyoming, Nevada, it's not necessarily a cost savings to filing in Illinois. There might be other non-financial reasons you would look to set up there.
Sure. Can a group elect to make an LLC an S Corp?
Yes, as long as all of the owners as long as all of the owners comply with the guidelines. So as long as all of the owners of the LLC are US citizens or green card holders, you only have one class of stock. You can have, like I said, 100 or less owners. Where it becomes an issue is if one of the owners wanted to hold their equity let's say they are like, oh, my family has an LLC where my wife and kids have ownership, that LLC cannot own equity in the S Corp. It would have to be through the individual.
All right. Let's see. Can you explain what exactly a brand is and how it differs from a business or a trademark?
So a brand would be, your legal name is what the state recognizes you as, and like typically the bank. So when a client pays you a check and your name is Widgets and Things LLC, they're going to write the check out to Widgets and Things LLC. Now, you can file an assumed name in Illinois where the state would recognize you as either or Widgets and Things LLC, or if you call yourself Widgets Mania on the side, as long as you file an assumed name and it's available, you could go by either or. Now, a brand or a trademark is a different concern because it doesn't have anything to do with your legal name. You could file a trademark to protect your legal name, or if you have an assumed name, or maybe you're trying to protect a specific product or a product line or a service arm of your business, those would be brands or a trademarkable thing. So you think about a parent company that has a number of different brands associated with it. The parent company is, it's got its legal name and it might have an entity for each brand, but each brand has its own trademark protections so that it can go use that name and that consumers identify that source of goods and services as that brand.
Great, thank you. Do you have any suggestions on banks to get funding through for someone who's struggling to get the funds but has excellent credit?
Don't go to big banks. Generally, the bigger banks like Chase, Wells Fargo, Fifth Third types, they are not very small business friendly. They're perfectly capable of serving. I have plenty of clients that use them, but if you're really, looking to, work with somebody, you want to work with a smaller local bank, a charter bank, where you can develop a relationship with a banker who might have a say on the lending committee or something where you'll get farther with them than you would, like, say, a Chase.
Okay. For a rental business, do you have to have a contract with the client, and do you establish that with an attorney?
Is this a real estate rental business? Or an equipment rental business? You want to have a rental agreement for sure. Obviously it's a different set of concerns with real estate than assets like equipment or something, but you certainly want to have an agreement in place that sets forth not only what they're paying you to rent whatever it is, but also the standards of conduct while they either possess the equipment or staying in the property. And it's sort of like a sublease if it's real estate. You need to have remedies as the landlord or the owner of the property in case somebody doesn't pay or destroys the property, or opens you up to liability for something they did. If it's a common unit, let's say it's a condo in a multi-unit building and they start a fire and it destroys the whole building, everyone's coming after you. So you need to have strong contracts in place for those things.
Sure. Do you need an LLC and or permit to sell on Etsy? Do you know?
No, you don't need an entity to do that, but it's a good idea to do that. Again, it's in terms of a permit, again, I would defer to an accountant on the tax side just to make sure there's no tax registrations from a sales tax standpoint. But just to create, a good on Etsy, I would recommend having an entity, but you don't need one.
Mm-hmm. Great. If someone is a single member LLC, do they need to insure their online business?
I would recommend, depending on the nature of it, having. This is a question I get asked all the time, like, what type of insurance should I have? And I always say, well, you should talk to an insurance broker because they can recommend the appropriate types of policies you would need and the type of coverage you would need depending on your circumstances. So it's important to know that there's no universal insurance policy for businesses. There's all different types of policies depending on what kind of business you operate, who your customers are, what you're selling or doing, and then also the appropriate limits of coverage. You may not need as much coverage as a bigger business, and so the premiums starting out are not going to be as expensive as when you're a more robust business catering to a larger, target market or something like that.
Okay. If someone with an Illinois LLC, for example, decides to leave Illinois, do they need to inform the Illinois Secretary of State?
So it depends what they're going to do. If they're going to continue operating the business, and they're moving to another state, there's a process called redomestication where you can move your entity from one state to another as if it was formed in the other state. But that depends on each state, because, for instance, Illinois permits inbound and outbound domestication, but certain states do not allow you to move. I recently had a client moving from Illinois to New York. Illinois permits you to move your entity out of Illinois, but New York does not allow you to move it into New York under these circumstances. So you have to look state by state. If you're just shutting it down and moving, you would either file a statement of termination to dissolve the LLC, or you let the LLC lapse and the state will eventually involuntarily dissolve your entity.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions on DBAs. One is just simply, how do umbrellas or DBAs work? And the second is someone who recently established an LLC and wants to know if they can later add a DBA or if they have to create a new entity for that.
Sure. So I had mentioned the term assumed name before. That's essentially a DBA. So if you want to call yourself something other than what your legal name is, you want to file for a DBA, and that's called filing an assumed name in Illinois. So you would file an assumed name application, and that application is unique. It does not get renewed every year. It gets renewed every 5 years. And it's on a payment schedule where I believe it's on like 2020 was the last renewal year. So 2025 will be the next. So depending on which year, as close as the renewal year, like 2025, you pay less filing fees. So if you filed it in 2020, you're going to pay the full filing fee. If you file it in 2024, you're going to pay a smaller filing fee because you only get it for a year. And you renew it every 5 years. And you can then use either your legal name or your assumed name interchangeably. And as long as it's important to bring that assumed name certificate once you get it to the bank, and then they'll have it on file. So a client can pay you by check or something is either or. And the second question there, you do not need to set up a new entity to file a subsequent assumed name. You can file it at any time. Like I said, it's just filing an assumed name certificate with or application with the Secretary of State.
Great. Can you get a business credit card without an LLC?
I assume without the question is without a business entity. Probably not. You need a separate business bank account typically to do that. And so in something I didn't cover in full before, in order to get a business bank account, most banks will ask you for your articles of incorporation, your federal tax ID, so that EIN letter we talked about, and most will ask for your, if you're an LLC, your operating agreement. And once they have those three things, they'll be able to open a business bank account for you. And please do not commingle personal funds with the business funds. I've seen issues with that. They're maintained separately. And at that point, you can apply for a credit card under the business account. Great.
If your business isn't profitable, does it make sense to create an LLC or not?
It always makes sense from the legal side. As I always tell clients, the reason we explore creating a business entity is 1, liability protection, 2, tax treatment, and 3, the administrative ideas of management control and how those differ. So the financial concerns of setting up an entity if it's not profitable, and this is something you can discuss with a tax professional, depending on what type of entity you have. Like a corporation, you can typically carry forward losses in subsequent years for tax purposes, so you can take deductions which are advantageous to you from a tax perspective. LLCs don't carry some of the same principles, so it's important to talk to a tax advisor about that. But from a legal side, I would always encourage, if you're operating a business, you want to have that liability shield in front of you in case somebody has a beef with the business. Your personal assets aren't at stake most of the time.
Great. A question, how to put an LLC in a trust? I'm assuming it's complicated.
Not as complicated as you think. So I just actually did this yesterday for a client. Essentially, all you need to do is check in the governing documents of the LLC. Most of the time, if you're going to transfer your ownership in an LLC to a trust, which is what you would do, you would want to make sure it's called a permitted transfer in the LLC agreement, so that it's something you don't need the other owner's consent for if it's a multi-owner entity. And typically you're doing this for tax purposes. And all you're really going to do is create, you would have a lawyer create, a transfer document where the equity of the LLC that's owned by you is now going to be owned by the trust. And usually you don't need consideration under the law to make that transfer.
Okay. Can you have more than one DBA?
Yes.
All right. For the same business or for multiple businesses? Okay, great. And then do you need an LLC or permit if you want to teach on your own?
So it depends what we're talking about. If you're teaching on the side, or as a tutor or something, sometimes it makes sense to set up as an entity, for contracting purposes. And again, if you file an S election, it may be advantageous where all the income, so the contract, let's say you're working through an agency where they're sending you places, the contract would be between your entity and the organization sending you places. And then you're protected from a liability standpoint. You might have some tax advantages to the revenue you're making doing that. But if you're just teaching at a school or something, unless the school, I have seen it before where like doctors at hospitals set up an LLC so that their income is streamed through the entity. And I've sometimes seen it with teachers, but not as common.
Great. And then we have a question about how do you get rights to sell things?
Sure.
Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're looking to sell. If you're talking about licensing rights, so if you want to sell, and by the way, it's a good question, because don't just start creating t-shirts with licensed apparel logos, like using sports leagues, teams, anything that's already owned by someone else. If you're going to sell that stuff, those agencies will find you and crack down on you and fine you and put you out of business, basically. So, the best thing to do is to, sometimes if you go to the source of whatever you're looking to license, they may have some information on their website if you want to start doing that. Sometimes it would be a lot harder to work something out if it's a really recognized brand or something. They may not have any interest because they may have a limited amount of vendors that they work with, or they may have information about applying to do that. And it may be a very strict process where they say, we need you to fill out all of this stuff, demonstrate to us your creditworthiness and your goodwill, and maybe we'll let you sell our stuff. But it depends on what you're trying to sell. So I can't answer that more fully without knowing exactly what that is.
All right. Let's see. So we just got one more question in. Let's see. What if you start a business and get an EIN, but then you don't do any business that year, so you don't make any money that same year? Do you need to file taxes on that EIN? I think we covered that in the sort of better safe than sorry category. Right. How strict is the government going to be about using Zelle or Venmo, for example, for small side businesses? Is there a maximum, and when does that kick in?
I will say that any reported income needs, or any income received from a business needs to be reported. I do not know, if there's a threshold that the government would look at, like if the IRS or the state would, I would assume you will get a 1099 from Zelle or Venmo or something each year when you're transferring money that way. especially if you set up, like, I know that those payment processors, usually you can set up a business account or something. I would assume they'll send you a 1099 showing you how much money you've received through there, and they're going to report that to the IRS. So you probably should too. But I don't know how often the IRS audits small businesses and digs through their receipts and stuff.
Right. So if this person is, for example, doing sort of random house baby pet sitting, for example, do they need to claim all of the small jobs, or get an EIN to claim it in their taxes? Is there like sort of a lower threshold of money that you can receive per year that you don't need to claim or start a business for?
Sure. I mean, my official answer is you're going to have to report all of that. It's the IRS would be interested in that. Practically, how reasonable would it be for them to, if you didn't report it? I don't know if they would figure that out or not. Going through the hassle of setting up a business for pet sitting on an occasion, I think it depends on the circumstances. If you're looking to expand that, certainly there's liability that exists in pet sitting. Something could happen to the animal, to you, to the house, and you could get blamed for it, and you want to make sure you're protected. But is it practical? It depends on the circumstances. Are these close friends you're house sitting for, pet sitting, or is it complete strangers?
Mm-hmm. Does creating an LLC protect you from someone stealing your business name, or do you also need trademark protection for that?
So again, that depends. Like, one, nobody can register your same business name with the Secretary of State in Illinois. But in terms of trademarking, registering a business doesn't protect your trademark, like the brand. So somebody in a different state could start using it. The only thing that protects you is filing a proper federal trademark, which gives you the ability to police your mark in all 52 states. You can go all over the country and protect it.
Great. And then for clarification, someone wants to know, can you file for tax exemptions for your small online business if you don't yet have an LLC, or can only LLCs deduct things?
That I cannot answer. I just don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Can or should you put products you sell on Etsy in an LLC?
I think we answered that before. Like, I would recommend, if you're going to consistently sell, to set up an entity. And if I have seen some Etsy stores take off, and you really want to be organized at that point.
Great. And then someone wants to know if you know what they need to start a school of language.
That is a good question, because I'm unclear as to whether that would require certain types of, there's some administrative oversight with schools. I would have to look at that more. I mean, there's a number of considerations. I think it depends what age group you're teaching. If it's children, there's certain requirements. You may have to register with DCFS. There might be certain permits and licenses you need to get. Maybe not. I don't know. I'd have to look into that.
Okay. So consult your local attorney for more details. All right. Well, thank you so much for staying over and answering all these questions, and for your wonderful presentation. For those who did not see in the chat, yes, we will be sending out both a copy of the recording once that's posted on the YouTube page, and then a copy of the slideshow as well to everyone who is registered for this webinar. If the QR code does not work for you, it's also in the chat. formellerlaw.com is the website if you would like to get in touch with our presenter to discuss these questions further or in more detail. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you especially to you, Matt, for all your expertise and all your help.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a good night.